The Playboy Mansion was one of the most famous addresses in Los Angeles. For decades, people knew it as the place where celebrities, athletes, models, and musicians all gathered for wild nights that made the tabloids. There were bright lights, endless drinks, and a sense that anything could happen behind those gates. To outsiders, it looked like pure glamour. But if you look closer at the history of those parties, the story isn't all sparkle. Some of those nights ended in tragedy, and the people caught up in it weren't nameless faces. They were young women with real lives, real futures, and dreams that ended too soon. One of the most heartbreaking stories tied to that world is that of Dorothy Stratton. Dorothy wasn't born into fame. She was a teenager from Vancouver who caught the attention of Hugh Hefner's team and quickly rose through the Playboy ranks. By 1980, she was crowned Playmate of the Year. She was just 20 years old and seemed to be standing at the start of a long career. She was acting in movies, being mentored by big names, and splitting her time between film sets and the mansion. But her personal life was complicated. Dorothy had married Paul Snyder, a man who had discovered her when she was working at a Dairy Queen back in Canada. At first, he managed her career, but as Dorothy's fame grew, their relationship began to break down. She wanted independence, and she had started a relationship with director Peter Bogdanovich, who cast her in his upcoming film, They All Laughed. In August 1980, Dorothy agreed to meet Snyder at the house they once shared. It was supposed to be about finalizing their separation. Instead, she was killed there. Dorothy's body was discovered later that day. She was just 20. The story shocked Hollywood. Here was a woman who had been celebrated at the mansion, who was appearing in films, who seemed to have escaped her old life, cut down in the middle of it all. Her death became the subject of books and films, including Star 80. But more than that, it showed the darker side of the world connected to the mansion, a place that looked glamorous but was also full of jealousies, insecurities, and pressures. Dorothy wasn't the only one. In the early 1970s, Hefner's parties were at their peak. Everyone wanted an invitation, and the mansion became a symbol of freedom and excess. But not everyone walked away unharmed. People close to Hefner, including Playboy Bunnies, later spoke out about drug use at those parties. For some, it became too much. Adrienne Pollock, who had worked as a bunny, lost her life after being overwhelmed by that lifestyle. Her story came out decades later in documentaries when women who had been there started talking about how easily nights at the mansion could spiral. By the 1990s and 2000s, the tragedies continued. Stacey Arthur, who had been Playmate of the Month in 1991, alleged that she was assaulted during a party at the mansion. After her story came out, her husband was later killed by a man who had been obsessed with her. The case was widely covered and added another dark chapter to the mansion story. Another young woman tied to Playboy, Elisa Bridges, was found dead in 2002 at a house in Benedict Canyon after spending time at mansion-connected events. The cause was listed as an accidental overdose involving multiple substances. She was 28. Her passing reminded people that behind the flashing cameras and glossy images were real struggles, ones that the glitzy setting often covered up. The mansion itself became almost mythical. To the public, it was about pools, movie screenings, celebrity sightings, and the famous grotto. People imagined it as a playground where nothing bad ever happened. But for many women, it wasn't just a playground. It was their workplace, their community, sometimes even their home. And that came with risks. There were pressures to look a certain way, act a certain way, and be available at all times. For some, those pressures led to dangerous situations. Even those who loved the mansion have admitted in later years that it wasn't always what it seemed. Former girlfriends and playmates have written memoirs and appeared in documentaries talking about what they went through. Some described it as fun and exciting. Others said it was toxic, with young women thrown into a world where they had little control. The mansion was also famous for its connection to Hollywood itself. Big-name actors, musicians, and athletes were regular guests. But those connections also blurred lines. Power imbalances were common. Young women trying to build careers found themselves in spaces with men who had all the power, both socially and financially. That imbalance created an environment where bad things could happen, and often did. When tragedy struck, like the deaths of Dorothy Stratton, Adrienne Pollock, or Elisa Bridges, they weren't just isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern where young women who were put on pedestals were also the most vulnerable. The mansion's image, carefully curated by Playboy, didn't always match the reality for the people living inside it. That doesn't mean every story tied to the mansion is dark. Many women built successful careers, leveraged the fame to move into acting, modeling, or business, and look back at their time there fondly. But it's important to remember the others, the ones who didn't get to live out those long careers, whose stories ended far too soon. Today, the mansion no longer carries the same mystique. After Hefner's passing in 2017, it was sold, and the era of wild Playboy parties faded. But the stories remain, some told by the women themselves, others whispered in Hollywood lore. When people talk about the glamour of those nights, it's worth remembering that there was another side too. A side where the lights went out, where the laughter stopped, and where lives were cut short. The Playboy Mansion will always be remembered as a symbol of a certain kind of Hollywood dream. Beautiful women, powerful men, endless nights. But if you look at the full history, it's also a symbol of how quickly those dreams could turn into something darker. And the people caught in that shift weren't fictional characters. They were real women with real stories. The deaths of Dorothy Stratton, Adrienne Pollock, and Elisa Bridges, along with the trauma experienced by women like Stacey Arthur, are reminders of how fragile life was in that world. Their names may not be as famous as the parties themselves, but they're part of the mansion's story. To tell the story of the Playboy Mansion honestly means telling both sides, the glitter and the heartbreak, because behind the gates, it wasn't just music, champagne, and celebrity smiles. It was also human, messy, and sometimes dangerous. And for some, it ended not in legend, but in silence.